All right, welcome in everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something that trips up a lot of folks in the safety world, especially those dealing with federal contracts for construction.
Oh yeah, for sure. It can be a real headache figuring out which rules apply when you've got Uncle Sam involved in a project.
So we're zeroing in on two key sections of the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, Section 103 and Section 107.
The infamous 103 versus 107 dilemma. I see it all the time. Safety folks scratching their heads trying to figure out which one governs their project.
So we're here to break it down, plain and simple, for all you safety pros out there, brought to you by Safety One Source, your go-to for staying on top of all things workplace safety. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is Section 103 all about?
Well, at its core, Section 103 is all about overtime pay requirements, making sure workers are compensated fairly when those hours pile up.
Yeah, everyone loves a bit of overtime pay, right? But it's more than just loving the extra cash. These are legal requirements we're talking about.
Absolutely, and this generally applies to any federal contract that involves laborers or mechanics. So pretty much any construction project you can think of.
Right, from those massive infrastructure projects to even smaller renovations. If it's a federal contract and you've got folks swinging hammers or operating machinery, Section 103 is probably on the table.
Now, it's not just direct federal contracts, though. It also applies to contracts that are getting a boost from federal assistance.
So things like loans, grants, those sorts of things.
Exactly, especially if those loans, grants, or guarantees fall under laws that set specific wage standards for that particular type of work.
Okay, so that's where things start to get a little bit tricky, right? Trying to figure out if those wage standards trigger Section 103.
Yep, and in the world of construction, one of the biggest players in setting those wage standards is the Davis-Bacon Act.
Right, Davis-Bacon, the prevailing wage champion. So if Davis-Bacon wage rates are required on a project, then those Section 103 overtime rules are most likely in effect.
That's usually a safe bet. However, there's this one little caveat that trips people up all the time.
Oh, do tell. I love a good curveball.
It all boils down to how the money flows into the project. If the only federal involvement is a loan guarantee or insurance, then those Section 103 overtime rules don't apply.
That makes sense. It's not about the federal government directly footing the bill for labor costs. It's about setting those baseline wage standards.
Precisely. So you can see how it's crucial to understand the exact nature of the federal involvement to figure out if Section 103 is in play.
Absolutely. And that's just Section 103. We haven't even touched Section 107 yet.
And 107 is a whole different beast. Let's shift gears and dive into that one.
Sounds good. So how does Section 107's coverage differ from what we've just discussed with 103?
Well, with Section 107, it's less about the funding source and more about the actual work being done, the nitty-gritty of the project itself.
So what are the specific criteria that bring Section 107 into play?
For Section 107 to apply, the contract needs to be under a statute that's subject to Reorganization Plan number 14 of 1950. This is basically the big picture framework for how federal labor standards are handled.
Okay, so there's some historical context here, tying it back to how these regulations were structured way back when.
Right, and then the work itself has to be very specific. It has to be for construction, alteration, and/or repair, including painting and decorating.
So very clearly defined in terms of the scope of work on the project.
Yeah.
No room for interpretation there.
Pretty much. So we've got two key elements: the underlying legal framework tied to that reorganization plan and the specific nature of the work being done.
Right. I'm starting to see the difference here. 103 is often about the funding, the dollars and cents tied to federal involvement, and those wage standards. But 107 is much more focused on the actual hands-on work happening on the construction site.
You got it. And here's where it gets really interesting. A project might have federal funding, but not fall under Section 107 if the work isn't strictly construction, alteration, or repair.
So maybe something like a research project that gets a federal grant but involves building a lab space. The building aspect might not trigger 107 even though there's federal funding.
Exactly. That's a great example. And on the flip side, you could have a construction project with minimal direct federal funding, but it's still subject to Section 107 if the underlying statute aligns with that reorganization plan number 14.
So even a small locally funded project could still fall under 107 if it's tied to a specific federal program or regulation related to construction safety.
That's the key takeaway here. For all you safety professionals out there, knowing which bucket your project falls into is absolutely crucial.
Couldn't agree more. And this is why we're doing this deep dive, right? To help folks out there understand these nuances.
Absolutely. It's about making sure you're applying the right set of rules and ensuring everyone's safety on the job site.
So to wrap it up, Section 103's overtime rules are often tied to the financial side of federal involvement, particularly those wage standards. But Section 107, on the other hand, is all about the type of construction work and whether it falls under that specific legal framework tied to Reorganization Plan Number 14.
It's not always black and white. Sometimes it's a bit of a gray area, but understanding these fundamental differences is a huge step in the right direction.
It empowers you to ask the right questions, do your due diligence, and ultimately create a safer work environment for everyone involved. And that's what it's all about.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So for all our listeners out there, here's a final thought to ponder. How does the type of federal involvement in a project signal which set of safety and labor regulations you need to prioritize? Think about it. A project funded by federal grants with Davis-Bacon wages will probably have a different compliance landscape than, say, a project that's using a federally insured loan and is focused on a big highway repair job. The nuances matter.
Absolutely. Knowing the ins and outs of these regulations is what separates good safety practices from truly excellent ones. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep those job sites safe out there. Thanks for tuning in.
And thanks for having me.
We'll catch you next time.